Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I am the chair of the Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative that was started about almost 4 years ago now. I want to really welcome you to what is the 27th event that we've held since February of 2020. And this one is on Asian American career ceilings, corporate journeys, and ethnic differences. Before I start and introduce our speakers, I want to first talk about the overall program, but also, how you navigate through the Q&A sessions, et cetera, for this 1 hour event. This was started because there was a perception, Committee 100, which has two missions, one of which is how to help Chinese Americans in society to achieve, not be discriminated against, et cetera, how to vote, et cetera. And so this falls under the domestic mission, which is to help Chinese Americans, which we broaden this to Asian Americans because we feel that's important to do, to help identify, one, is there a problem? And the answer is yes. What are the causes? Are there differences by whether you're in academics or in corporate or nonprofit, so forth? Are there differences if you're female or male? But also, what are the kinds of solutions that are available to help all of you who are in different stages of your careers succeed and get to the top if that's what you want to do. So that's the whole purpose here. In this particular session, I'm very pleased to have three very successful people in corporate America, but three different ethnicities: Indian American, Japanese American, and Chinese American. And one of them happens to be a fellow Committee 100 member, Jenny Ming. Two things. One is we're going to go about an hour. There'll be about 30 to 40 minutes of fireside chat. And I have a list of questions that I'm going to ask the panelists to answer in whatever the order they wish. In terms of a Q&A, we're going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for people to ask questions. And the way you ask question is just type in your question in the chat box. The last is we have two upcoming events that I want to alert you to. One is on July 20th. We have never had one on this topic, which is what are the obstacles in academia? As it's a real issue there are issues with regard to whether Asian Americans succeed at universities in terms of getting rising through the ranks of academia. And there we have Gordon Chang, who is a professor at Stanford, Frank Wu, who's president of Queens College, and Guiyu Huang, who is president of Western Illinois University. All three happen to be Committee 100 members, but that's not why they were chosen. That will be on July 20th from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern time. And the other one that's coming up on September 11th, we have Margaret Chin, who is the author of she's a professor at Hunter College, and she wrote a very interesting book with a very nice title called Stuck, which again, of course, is on this issue of Asian American career ceilings. So, that invitation will go out in August. So with that, I'm just going to briefly introduce the names of our three and the titles of our three panelists, but then I'll ask them each to take 2 minutes and just talk about what they do and sort of how they got there. We have Ratnakar. He is a senior vice president and chief strategy officer of DuPong. He's had an incredible career in different companies, but he's been at DuPont for a number of years, and his job is to formulate and execute the strategy of DuPont in its transformation, which many of you are probably quite familiar with. We have Ken Tanji, who is executive vice president and chief financial officer of Prudential Financial. He's a very successful career in finance and went to the same college that I do, but that wasn't the reason why he was. That's not why he was selected. But he overcame that handicap, right, Ken? All right.
That's right. Despite that.
And Jenny Ming, who is the CEO and coach mentor of ExCo leadership, but she was formerly the CEO of Charlotte Russe and the co-founder and former president of Old Navy, which I suspect everyone has gone to Old Navy at some point. That's we clothed our son throughout his growing years only in Old Navy. So we're very grateful to Jenny. And she happens to be a committee of 100 member. So with that, let me start. And if perhaps each of you, again, take 2 minutes, just say, what are you doing today? And a little bit about your career history. And we'll just arbitrarily, Ken, we'll start with you.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Peter, and hello, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Chief Financial Officer for Prudential. A little bit about Prudential. We have $4 trillion of insurance in force, protecting Americans and other people throughout the globe. We manage $1.4 trillion of investments for individuals and institutions, and we do that with 40,000 associates in 50 countries. I've been with Prudential for 35 years. That's kind of rare these days that someone stays that long. You know, people wonder I couldn't get a job elsewhere was probably the explanation for that. But I had the opportunity to hold various roles across our businesses and corporate areas, and I've been CFO for the last 5 years.
Okay, Jenny, you're next.
Oh, wow. When I left college, I was a buyer. So I became a buyer within 4 years. And at that time, I also had 3 kids. I had all 3 kids under the age of 2. I'm sure all of you wonder how I did that. I had a little girl at 17 months, and then 17 months later, I had twins. And that was a time that actually the Gap called to see if I was interested in joining them as a merchandise manager. At that time, Gap was doing something very innovative in specialty retailing. Of course, when you have 3 kids under the age of 2, the last thing you want is a new job. But when the right opportunity called, I couldn't turn it down. And I joined them as a merchandise manager for activewear. I was able to grow the business double every year for 7 consecutive years. And I got a double promotion from a merchandise manager to be a divisional merchandise manager and a vice president title. I could say that was a turning point in my career. And then when they thought about starting a new division, which is mass and value, which became Old Navy, I was the first person they asked to join this new division. We started with 11 people, and it's probably the most successful startup. We were profitable from day one. And we won many accolades from, we were the first retailer to hit $1 billion in less than 4 years. We won many for store design, advertising, marketing. And, during that 5 years, they asked me if I was interested in being president, and I turned it down because things were going so well and I did not want to rock the boat. And they interviewed a lot of people during that year. And I was thinking, gosh, if someone else came in to be president, I would probably be very disappointed. So a year later, I told my boss, who's Mickey Drexler at that time, that I was interested. And he started laughing. He said, Jenny, it took you long enough to come and want this job. So I became the first president of Old Navy. So I was in Gap. I was in Old Navy for 13 years, 7 years as the president and 20 years at Gap Inc. And I was ready to move on. And, I joined, I did a lot of nonprofit, travel for pleasure for a change, and joined some boards. I got some, when I was told that I was leaving Gap Inc., I had a lot of inbound interest. So instead of joining a retail board, I joined Kaiser, which is the largest integrated healthcare system. I wanted to do something different and learn something from a different industry. And I also joined a private equity, which they bought Charlotte Russe for me to run as a CEO. I did that for 10 years. And now I focus on my board work. I'm on 6 boards, besides Kaiser, Levi's, Kendra Scott, Affirm, and also a Guerrilla Commerce. And I also am an executive coach and mentor. I focus helping women getting into C-suite and especially CEO. I'm very excited about what I'm doing today. As you can see, I'm never in a comfort zone. I'm always taking risks and always learning and doing something new and different.
So Jenny, rumor has it that you only started Old Navy so that you could get the family and friends rate for your 3 kids. Is that right?
Yes, but just so you know, when I left Gap Inc., they gave me a lifetime discount.
Oh, wow.
All the
Fantastic.
brands. So that was worth it, right?
All right. Raj, you're next.
Yeah. So I'm Raj. I head strategy, M&A. Basically, I drive the transformation of our portfolio at DuPont. Been here for 4 years. My history is more about changing, company, large scale transformation in corporates. So I did the same thing prior to this. I was at another company called Danaher, a multi-industrial company. There, I was, led the breakup of the company, created another company called Fortive, a $7 billion revenue business. But prior to that outside of my corporate world, I was with McKinsey for a handful of years. But my first beginning of my life was all software, and I was a master's in mechanical engineering. I came to the US 33 years back to do a master's in mechanical engineering at Maryland. But over the years migrated. I was a software, built 3 different businesses, and the last one with like 10 million revenue, sold it very small way back, but then migrated into the corporate world after a small stop at Wharton and such. So that's my story. Peter, thanks for inviting, and happy to be here.
Yeah. Now I'll start with the first question. Now, the 3 of you ultimately have been successful in your careers, so it's not like you got blocked at some VP level or so forth. But I also know that each of you at some point faced some career obstacles, and partly due to ethnicity, right? I mean, in fact, one of the advantages of having panelists who are not 25 years old is you started your careers during a period where the world was quite different and has changed, but hasn't changed enough. So I'm going to ask each of you, what were some of the career obstacles that you personally faced, and the ones in particular that you faced because you felt due to your Asian ethnicity? And I'm going to go in reverse order this time and start with you, Raj.
Yeah, I think, just to clarify, your question was what were the hurdles that we faced? Is that the
what
question?
career obstacles, right?
Career obstacles,
and were some of them related to ethnicity?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a bit of a glass half full kind of guy. So I don't feel in my 32 years in this country, I feel like the word discrimination. I don't feel that was true for me, at least. By the way, I live in Philadelphia, the jobs here. But for my first 10 years, I worked in Cedar Rapids, Iowa for Rockwell. I worked for Union Pacific Railroad in Omaha. I was in Kansas City for 10 years, did a lot of, one of my businesses over there, and did a lot of things with, fairly Midwestern conservative world. I think what there is, and by the way, I've been in professional settings. I've not been a blue collar worker, perhaps where the environment might have been different or something, right? As is obvious for all of us and most of the panelists, most of the attendees here as well. I think what you find more so is biases. It may be unconscious biases. It may be just naturally people kind of feeling. I think that kind of thing is very normal. And that might very well be what you might call career obstacles. When I was a software developer, it was almost like, oh, you're an Indian and therefore you're likely to be really good in programming. So now I'm in M&A, and if I do that, you don't see very many people driving large scale M&A transformations as being coming from Indian origin. They tend to be more Caucasian, people who went for undergrad at Yale and the likes, and you kind of wonder, and probably that's true for you, Peter, as well. And I think then people normally, I take that as an advantage. I like the underdog status. You think I'm not as smart as you, that's okay, sit down and we'll eventually it becomes obvious who knows what. I think there are but I think it's a little bit about, we are, by the nature of how we look, the nature of, it doesn't take too long to figure out we are from a different origin, and therefore I think it's there, and therefore in the related, depending on the context you're in, I think you find people that think that maybe you don't have that kind of characteristics. A lot of people from Asian backgrounds are thought as not as smart as, particularly Jenny's background particularly. No offense to Ken or myself, we've achieved things, but in a retail world, that's not what you see, a smart, savvy salesperson rocking the, just like shaking everything up. That's not normal profile for a, you think they're, I mean, Asians more often than not, again, I'm drawing on stereotypes, this is how people think, are more relatively shy, or they're good with sort of the STEM aspects of things, with numbers and STEM. And, I think that those kinds of things come into play. And I think at different points, I've seen that in my career, but it hasn't like been to a point where I'd call it discriminate, where they know I might be capable, yet they push me aside just because they didn't like who I am. I think I haven't seen that. I've seen biases, and I think that's an important point I'd make.
Yeah, Jenny, whether it's discrimination or biases, did you experience any along the way?
Yeah, you know what, I think more as a woman first before being even as an Asian. I remember I was passed up for a promotion, and I felt that I had even better financial result than the other person, but I was never considered. So instead of sitting and wondering, in fact, the next day I went in and talked to the head of merchandising. I said, why wasn't I considered for this promotion? And, he said to me, he said, well, you have 3 kids. I just didn't think you were ambitious. And I said, why would you assume that? So, I felt that first discrimination as a woman. I didn't think it was because I was Asian. But I think it's so important to speak up about it when you don't feel something is right and learn why. I think so many of Asians, as you said, we tend to be very quiet about it. And that was never I was always very comfortable speaking up my mind, even when it's not popular. Because I think maybe it's because being in retail, it's so important to have a point of view about your product and to talk about it and selling it. So for me, it's very natural to ask, why wasn't I being considered? So I told him, I said, I absolutely was ambitious and I do want to move up the ladder. And he actually apologized. He said, you know what, you're right, Jenny. I shouldn't assume that you're not ambitious. So I think it's very important to speak up. But I do feel that as an Asian, I don't know if I was discriminated, even though I was like the second command after the CEO, but I was never considered the CEO successor at Gap Inc. And I think that has to do with my demeanor being Asian and being a woman. At that time, and again, you have to remember this is 20 years ago, right? Today, I think it might be different.
Yeah, well, for sure, though, there are generational differences. For example, I think, and it's been changing. It hasn't completely changed, but I think still today, a lot of the Asian American families, they tell their kids, study hard, go, be a scientist, put your head down and you'll succeed. And that's, to be honest with you, some of the handicaps are self-created, right? The parents don't say, oh, run for student government or learn these political skills or complain if you think that things are wrong. And so some of the problems are societal, but some of them are self-created. Ken, for you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe like Raj and Jenny, I feel very fortunate. I've been very supported throughout my career. And so I don't know if I'd call it necessarily discrimination, but we all face stereotypes, right? I mean, that's just the way the world works. And, for me, whether it's sort of, yes, good with math, and maybe a good number 2, smart, kind of, but could Ken really lead was a bit of a question once I got to a point in my career of, where the opportunities come to lead larger groups, to be the person in the front, to represent the company in certain forums. And, and some of it was, just naturally who I am as well, would raise some of those questions. I tend to be quiet. I'm introverted, and not, I listen much more than I like to talk. And so I had to adapt myself and make that transition to get some of these opportunities as well. Some of which was a result of being maybe a stereotype, but some of it was also kind of my natural tendencies as well. I think it was a good combination of both, which led to my own challenges. And so it's one, understanding what those stereotypes may be, but it's also understanding who you are and what you need to overcome for yourself in order to get some of the opportunities as well. So yeah, I think we all face these things.
Yeah. Now, for all of you, of course, you're in 3 different industries, right? Very different: industrial, financial, retail. I think part of the question that people don't ask themselves is, are there differences in styles and obstacles by industry? And that clearly is the case, right? That, for example, what Ken, you're saying, some industries, listening actually gets you ahead. Others, being very, extroverted and promoting yourself is the only way to succeed. I've been in investment banking, and I gotta tell you, if you're quiet and don't say anything, you're not getting anywhere. So do you see the same thing? Because I think the 3 of you are in 3 different industries, but also, a lot of people in different industries and so forth. And do you feel that there's some differences by industry in terms of what you have to do to succeed as an Asian American?
I think sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
No, you go.
So I can tell you for a fact, I have been in different industries, right? So I was in tech doing software, very much a software person. I've been in, I was in telecom for a while. And then my last business I had built was in telecom. And then over the years, I've gravitated more towards, industrial and now chemicals as well. I do agree. I think it's very true. It also is a little dependent on, the more people are exposed to people from Asian backgrounds, the more they're used to the differences and the nature of the perspectives, the thinking that different people bring. An example is tech, for example, right? If you get into software, the CEOs of Google, IBM, Microsoft, and there's probably more, Adobe, these are all, many of the leading companies are all Indians today, of Indian origin. So it's not, those places, whatever ceiling was there, it's already long broken, right? I think even if you look at, and I think it's very rare, on the other hand, to see an Indian CEO in a very, very large retail. And it's, but most recently, Starbucks' CEO just became somebody of Indian origin. And I think that is true, but I can for sure tell you the views here at DuPont, which is the more extreme conservative chemical company. Not that again, there's no real discrimination or biases, but the kind of diversity you would see here is a lot different than you would see in a tech company like Microsoft. Or I think that is sort of true. But I think I would attribute it more towards how much exposure they had. The more people, the software by definition, there was a shortage of talent. More people came from the outside, and therefore they saw more exposure. It may also have something to do with some of the software companies are based in parts of the country that are more cosmopolitan, whereas some of the industrial companies are much more in the deep Midwest, which has less diversity in general. So I think those are my observations. Jenny, I'm not sure if I interrupted you when you were about to say something. But
Ken and Jenny, see, now you're being deferential to each other, so there's something wrong here, right? Ken, Jenny, any comments about differences by industry?
I would say retail, especially in the Bay Area. There's lots of Asian, especially women in the industry, especially being a buyer, even up to, vice president. But I think the difference is really breaking through to the C-suite and become the president or CEO is harder. And, it's a question I always ask, why is that? And I think so many of us always say, we tend to be complacent, or do we really want to go for it? Or is there a chance that you fail and you're afraid to fail, so you don't go for it? I think that's actually one of the reasons. Or we just very comfortable, things are going well. You also have a family, so you think about it. Being at a certain level, being number 2 is a very good place to be. So I would say retail is a lot of, Asian women, but breaking through to the very top, there's just very few.
And any comments on different industries?
Yeah, I've only been in one industry, financial services, so I can't speak from experience, but maybe within even within industries, right, different varies by role. So in financial services, you have, if you're an analyst, or someone who's working in smaller teams or individual contributors, you tend to see Asians doing quite well there and playing into those roles. But when you get to leading larger groups or having general management, or sales or marketing or those other types of roles, it gets a bit thinner.
Yeah. By the way, I'll make one observation, which is the opportunity that turned into an obstacle. So, when there was suddenly a lot of growth in Asia, and so companies were establishing regional headquarters, et cetera, or someone who was sort of head of Asia, the region, whatever, they had the bias of selecting Asians, right, for that position. So the head of Asia would be this person, Chinese or whatever it is. On one hand, you could say, well, that was an opportunity because there was a lot of growth in Asia. But there is a hidden problem with that, which is people then to have this bias that, well, if he's Asian, we'll assign him to Asia. And if you look, you'll see that there are very few cases where people started in the Asia division or whatever, of a company, ended up back in the C-suite at corporate headquarters. So in a sense, it was almost like a false opportunity, right? Because what it did was it created an opportunity if you want to be, head of Asia for whatever, but it generated a bias that was actually very destructive. So it's very, it's very tricky, when you think about it. I'd like to turn to the second half of our question, which is this issue of differences by Asian American ethnicity. Now, the fact is the data shows that there's some big differences. And in fact, 3 or 4 of our webcasts, Committee 100 Asian American Career Season webcasts, have featured well-known experts in this area. For example, we had Michael Morris, who is a professor at Columbia Business School, and Jackson Liu, who's a professor at MIT Sloan School. They jointly have done 8 studies looking at Asian American career suits, but they did a couple related to this issue of differences by ethnicity within Asian. And what they found is what I think Raj referred to is Indian Americans do extremely well. In fact, East Asians don't do as well as South Asians, right? And they went through a number of the reasons. And if they look at data, in fact, Indian Americans do not only better than other Asian Americans, but they do better than Caucasians, if you just look at the statistics. And they looked at the reasons. They said, well, it's not because they look the same as Caucasians, because that's not true, et cetera. And they went through the reasons. And they had some very surprising and interesting reasons why that's true. And there are also differences between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans and Korean Americans, so forth. So what I'd like to do is ask the 3 panelists to talk about that. One, do you believe that that's true, that there are differences by ethnicities within Asian? But the other is, do you have any theories yourself as to why that is true, to the extent you believe is true? And I'll let any of the panelists speak in whatever order they wish.
Maybe I'll go first because I have just a little bit to add here, because I hadn't experienced it too much or studied or thought about it. But it doesn't surprise me because the cultures are very different. So to think that they have different outcomes or different experiences, to me makes sense, because they are very different and unique. The only other thing I can think of, or maybe perhaps experiences, is South Asians tend to be more outgoing if you're going to overgeneralize things, and more willing to speak up, and that tends to be a bit more accepted and expected in Western cultures than as one possible explanation. But I'll turn it to others.
Jenny, any comment?
I actually was going to wait for Raj to speak.
Okay.
Oh, Raj, the party animal, right? Right?
I think there was also, I think I was, I think there's a couple of observations. One was as culturally can refer to something which I was, for half my career, I was very shy. So I was not a shy externally, but at work, I was taught, so we are brought up, at least most of us, I think, are brought up in a hierarchical manner where elders are respected. I mean, you behave very differentially to elders, that you kind of carry it into work as well. When somebody is a CEO or a president, I struggle to call them by first name because I'm used to Mr. is what. So there's a lot of these things, and even till as late as when I was in Danaher, Peter, is like, even with Culp, he was like, my biggest feedback is I'm too differential. I'm not speaking up and challenging. So I think it's something that I had to cultivate. And I think that's one aspect that's common for all of us. Perhaps there are some parts of the world, as Southeast Asia, a lot of North India tends to be a little different than South India, which is where I come from. So there's these nuances that actually, and it goes back to Jenny's point, right? If you don't speak up, you get kind of, you let the stereotypes and the biases drive decisions unless you break that with speaking up and showing that you're different. I was in the other half, now I'm in a different camp. It's developed over time. Were you saying something, Jenny?
No, I was going to say that, we were all brought up as Asians to be humble and to conform to, to the mass or to the room. I mean, you do have to speak up because people don't know what you're thinking, right? And when you don't have a point of view, it's hard to be a leader when you have no vision or no point of view. So I think maybe the language barrier I think is very important for different nations. I also think that, I find that most Asians doesn't want to debate or argue. I want to say it in a healthier, positive way, because you could have different point of view and, be a good listener, but I find Asians tend to just let it happen, not speaking up. But I would say Southeast Asian tend to have a stronger point of view and not be afraid to speak up. And I think the language barrier they're stronger at. I'm generalizing probably more than anything, but I think, to be a leader, you do need to speak up and have a point of view to really lead a group. I think that's very important.
I've had the great privilege of having some very good friends who become well-known CEOs of companies, whether it's Ajay Banga, who is the CEO of MasterCard and is now the head of the World Bank, Raj Gupta, who is the CEO of Roman Haas, so forth. So I've been very privileged to know some people who are Indian American, so forth. And what they've said, which is also what the research shows, is there are at least two reasons that distinguish Indian Americans over, East Asians, so forth. One is they're more likely to want to work as a group. I know Chinese families, they're very loyal to their families, but they're less likely to gather as a group to try to solve a problem or get ahead and so forth. Whereas Indian Americans, it's more common for them to, gather as a group to try to help, right? The other is mentorship. And I think, Jenny, you probably know this quite well because that's one of the things you talk about, which is you have to have a mentor, and you had mentors, and I suspect all three of you had mentors. And there's a greater tendency for Indian Americans to see that as an essential part of their success, whether the person is Indian American or not Indian American, right? But more part of the culture of doing that. And it's less so, if you're talking about, Korean Americans or Japanese or Chinese Americans. I think a good proxy for that is what's happening in terms of members of Congress by ethnicity. There had been a dramatic increase in the number of Indian Americans who are congressmen and governors, etc., Nikki Haley's and so forth of the world.
Vice president.
And the vice president, who's half, half. Yeah, it's really sad because it seems like whenever someone is half Asian, half the other, the Asian part becomes like a footnote, right? I mean, one of the greatest golf players in the world was half Asian, right? But apparently people ignore that. But I think what happened is about 5 or 6 years ago, and you can read articles about this, the Indian American community said, we need more representation and we need more people voting. So they got together as a group. They formed some groups to raise the money, to identify candidates, and really pushed hard. And it was an explicit effort, but it was a group effort. Whereas I think you won't find that among, Japanese Americans, for example, at that level. And the results are today, think of how many Indian Americans are congressmen, for example, so forth. So at least there are two, and I'd like your reaction whether the data seems to suggest that, but maybe in the world where data doesn't really tell the truth, does that ring, the thing about one working together and the other is mentorship, does that ring true to you as panelists in your own experiences?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think so many more Chinese American prefer to be individual contributor versus being, a team player, working among a team or leading a team. Again, I'm generalizing. I think mentorship is very important at any level, because I think it really helps you to have someone sponsoring you, helping you through as a thought partner. All of that, I think, could only be positive toward your career. So I would agree with you. And helping each other, I think networking and helping each other is very important part of moving up the ranks. I would agree.
Yeah, and Jenny, you had mentors. How about Raj, you and Ken? Did you have mentors along the way that helped?
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah. Early in my career, someone took an interest in my career, and I was very lucky. This person did, and what that person did was actually help me see beyond just the next couple of years, which is, what people are typically focused on, and got me thinking about setting my sights higher and longer term. That was really helpful to me, because again, usually most people are focused on just what's immediately next, and looking incrementally at what you're trying to accomplish, as opposed to thinking, 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out, what are you really working towards in your life? And so I did find that very helpful.
Raj, yourself?
Yeah, I think mentors are absolutely critical. I think I've sought out mentors more and more as I grew older and wiser. But I think it does make a world of difference. I have so many mentors. I always reach out now. I think it's a critical component of that. But just to go back to your findings of what drives, I think I relate to the second point, which is the mentors, the working in the group. I don't know Indians are any different. I think there's another driver that I almost want to point out is if you come from sort of our ages, like a generation different than what is happening today, India was more, the culture in India was getting to be more exposed to Western styles. And therefore, English is my first language. English is not my second language. And I would struggle with every other Indian language when it comes to writing. So I speak to my mother in my language. I write to her in English even now. There's the only way we can communicate. So that's within the family, and everything I did in school, everything else, the fact that it's English, the fact that how much Western elements had kind of crept into the Indian culture was significantly more than perhaps China at that point. Now, Japan has been quite different all along, but China, if you roll the clock back when we all came to the country, I'm sure we're not that many years apart, was a lot different than today. Shanghai is different. Obviously many Chinese cities are so different. And I think that when you come here, it's a question of how many ways are you different than, from being similar to another local natively born, grown person, not Native Americans, you know what I mean? But how many degrees of difference? At least there's that part of language becomes less of an issue. The way you carry yourself in the social circles becomes less different. And then you kind of have a little bit more similarities, even if you look different. And I think those kind of may have helped Indian from my generation. It's getting to be lesser so as China has evolved so incredibly in the last 30 years. It's become.
You know, if you look at history and link history to Raj, what you're saying, it's kind of interesting because although there are a lot of things that the British did that were not so nice about India when they were in control of India, one of the things they did do that, you know, which helped, at least in this dimension, was imposing the English language on a lot. Whereas China, that's not true, right? In Japan, it wasn't necessarily true. Or there's a little bit more in Korea learning, but I think that is a factor. One of the things I wonder on this mentor thing is a lot of people think of just having a good relationship with your boss, but and in your own company. But that's not necessarily what mentoring is necessarily all about. You can and should have mentors who are well above just the level of your boss, but you got to do it carefully so that you don't, ruin your relationship with your boss. But the other is the mentors don't have to be in the same company or the same industry, right? Anyone want to talk about that? Whether you had any experiences in that regard? Because most people tend to think of, well, I have to have a good relationship with my boss, right? But that is a very narrow definition of mentorship. Any comments?
My mentors have been mostly outside. It's very hard. I mean, my bosses have been mentors, no doubt. I've had varying degrees of relationships and learned a lot from the boss. But that tends to be a little bit more of it's harder to be, when you're with a mentor, oftentimes you're much more open and talking about all the things that are going wrong. Of course, I've had mentors who are my bosses, but I get a lot more when I reach out to people who are, I mean, Raj Gupta, one name you mentioned, as you know, Peter, he's a huge mentor of mine. He and I have never worked together. I just reached out to him because I heard how wonderful he was. I cold called him actually and just told him who I was and how much I'd learned about him. I just wanted to meet him. And then he invited me for lunch. And then from there on, he's been a mentor. And we've had I think reaching out to find people you admire and wanting to be is something that I think you get a lot more. You're much more vulnerable. You can say who you are. It's a safer space than if you bypass your boss and go to your boss's boss and start becoming. I mean, it may go well in many places. It may not go well. Things like that.
Yeah. By the way, Raj Gupta has been a friend of mine for 30 years, and I totally agree with you. He is such a wonderful person, and he's a very giving person, regardless of whether he thinks he's going to get anything back. He just believes in good people and so forth. Ken and Jenny, mentorship above. I was going to say, to the side.
We may be proving out the East Asian versus South Asian difference here, because I would never. It would be really hard for me to reach out to somebody and do that. I would find that just difficult, and not for any good reason. I probably shouldn't, but and so I would encourage everybody not to be, but it hasn't been my experience. I have, most of my mentors have been people that I've worked with, and sort of had a natural reason to be interacting with.
Jenny?
I would be the same with Ken. Most of my mentor has been my bosses or bosses' bosses.
Yeah.
And I think what they helped me with earlier in my career was confidence, things that I didn't think I was good enough or was not. Actually, they always felt I could do so much more. But I agree with you, Raj, is that you should always find mentors outside of your own, sphere. I get tons of people requesting for my mentorship, and actually, I more often I say yes, is because I, like all of us, we want to pay forward and give back. And I think we should not be afraid to reach out, and more often people would say yes is because they do want to help. So I think it's a very important point. Mentorship and sponsorship is very important.
Which is just a great example. Like I mentor people myself, and I do, like you said, Jenny, I love to do it. I really, and I always say yes and really get a lot. I get much more out of it than I think the people I mentor get out of it. But yet I would find it really hard to ask someone to be a mentor. So there's something culturally there or something there.
Who's already the three of us?
Okay, Ken, I assign Jenny will be your mentor and Jenny will be, and Ken will be, and Raj has already signed up, so I'm not going to sign him to anyone, right? So now we have 7 questions here. So and about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to walk through a couple of questions. The first one, actually, I didn't see this, but I'll repeat it, but I think we've already talked about it, which is, does a British colonization of South Asia, exportation of British English and schooling, give South Asians an advantage with regard to Western leadership stuff? Actually, it's a good point because they're pointing about Western versus, anywhere else. What does the panelists think about this impact on the difference between South and East Asians in U.S. leadership? We've already answered that question, but I thought it would be interesting just to read that. The second one says, did any of the panelists do certain things differently to intentionally buck the stereotypes projected onto them, or have some advice? Any panelist can answer this.
I certainly didn't come from a traditional, technical background. I was not very good at math or science. I tend to really, do well in the social creative aspect. So I really encourage people, don't be a stereotype. You should, because you're Asian, you should be an engineer, you could be a finance, but, venture into broader, functions. I think is very important. Not to be afraid to step into something uncomfortable is something I would very much suggest.
Ken or Raj?
I think I agree. I think it's important to know what biases are likely given your roots, and knowing that and de-emphasizing that and emphasizing other things are something that's important in my opinion. Generally speaking, I'm much more careful in how all along in terms of the way I dress too, because there's a natural bias, at least when I was in my tech days and others, that you're not as good, well dressed, or you look, just simple things, even figuring out how it is. If you think you're shy, people know you're shy. They kind of I remind myself that people think I'm of some, I kind of always think, what are the biases? I make myself cognizant of that and do efforts at different points to actually separate from there. Another thing, this may not be exactly related, but a lot of us, if you're first generation, meaning you just came from, like myself, grew up in India and came here, if I find another person of my own state or whatever, I start talking my language? And it's really important. Sometimes people come to me and talk to my language. I say, stop it. I switch, I go to English because I don't want somebody else around me talking. Not that I don't want to be different. The effect, not that I'm not proud of. Outside of work, I'm happy to talk my language. I feel good about it. But at work, when there's others involved, I never, ever do that. I think being thoughtful about in Rome, be Roman, just sort of be cognizant of what would make you look more different. Sometimes it's a strength, but a lot of times people want the more homogeneity you're able to build, it's actually helpful. Again, not to forget and be shy or ignore or be humble, be embarrassed about your roots. But I think being thoughtful about using your differences where necessary versus saying, hey, I'm just like you, I got all your skills, I think is helpful.
Now, the next question, an interesting distinction. So one of the attendees says, are sponsors as important as mentors?
I would say yes. Sponsor is someone that really is within the company sponsoring you for, certain position, for certain programs, suggestions, really looking out for you. While mentors can be outside your organization, that's giving you maybe advice, be a sounding board, or like you say, Raj said, really be able to talk about anything and everything. I do feel that you probably could use both a sponsor and a mentor, but if I have to pick one, I would say mentor is more important than a sponsor.
Yeah, and I think of, official sponsors are hard. It's a unique situation. There are sponsors, they may not, walk around with a label of a sponsor, but if someone's saying, this person is really good for that, you should, give them the opportunity. Those are that to me, that there's plenty of people out there that you want to have doing that. And those are sponsors, but they may not be going around with a label called sponsor. But you want to have a lot of people advocating for you, I think would be my best way to describe it.
Yeah, and a mentor can be a sponsor at the same time, but there's a big difference because a sponsor is helping you to go up and a mentor is giving you good advice and may or may not be a sponsor, right? I think that's the distinction. Raj, any comments on the sponsor versus mentor?
No, I'm not that familiar with the sponsor. I struggle with the distinction. I'm more familiar with the mentor concept and not a sponsor.
Now, here is an interesting question that I have never seen before. So, to the panelists, did you ever intentionally, away from your natural personality, adopt habits or expressions or, I guess, activities such as football watching, political views, personal or family hobbies, or non-Asian colleagues, or for the purpose of advancing or fitting in? And did it help? This is an interesting question, because I had a friend who just was an immigrant. He didn't know anything about football, but he said, I got to learn about football because I got to be able to talk about football with my colleagues, for the specific purpose. So I remember talking about it and I said, well, you better make sure you really know, because you might just become silly if you say some stupid stuff, right? But anyway, any comments on that? It's an interesting question, right? And the risk, of course, is that you look fake, right?
I mean, unless you really are interested in a certain topic, I can't imagine trying to fit in and, I think you have to be your authentic, real self. Not something that is what people expect of you. So no, I've never done that myself.
But do you know of people who've done that?
No, not really.
No.
Maybe they did, I did not know, but I can't imagine.
I think picking up hobbies, I fully agree. I've never done that. I've never sort of just for the sake of, fitting in. But I think habits, if you define that a little broader expression, sort of that goes back to the comments I made right earlier, knowing my stereotypes and how I might adjust that a little differently, be more conscious and index a little differently. I've made choices like that, and I do that along at different points in my career. My style of how I carry, how do I break the stereotypes so I don't look like those kinds of natural day-to-day stuff are definitely things I made adjustments.
Yeah. Now, we have a lot of questions. Some are overlapping quite a bit, so I won't ask them because they overlap. I have one question, which I know we agreed that I was going to tell you what questions I was going to ask in advance, but now I'm going to violate my promise to you. Now, we know that Jenny has 3 kids, right? I don't know, Raj, whether you have kids, and Ken, you have 2? Ken, do you?
Yes, I have 4.
Oh, you have 4. Okay, so now this question is legitimate for all of you. Think of this question about success as Asian Americans in this society and reflect on your children. One, what kind of advice and what kind of guidance have you given them, and how is it different from what your parents were doing? That's certainly in my case, having an old-fashioned Chinese American father born in 1920 was pretty tough, right? It was study hard and go to MIT and all the rest of the world you'll be successful, right? And that was tough. How my wife and I raised our son is quite different in a different world, but also with a different philosophy. So for each of you, tell us a little bit about how you, as parents, what kind of guidance and advice have you given your children? And then what seems to be the outcome? Because I think all of you are old enough so your kids are not 3 years old, so probably they're embarked on some kind of career. Ken, you want to go first?
Yeah, he has 4 of them, so he gets the.
You know, so
I'm picking on the introvert, right?
yeah. The you know, if you think about the Japanese culture, it's very conforming, right? So when my father came from Japan to the U.S. And married my mother, was American, grew up in Pennsylvania, but it was Scottish, and we grew up in Minnesota. So that's how unique my experience is. But where in Minnesota, there's not many Japanese, and his philosophy was there as Japanese would, is you're American, you're in the Midwest, you'll grow up as a Midwestern American. And that's how I was raised. Having said that, we were very proud of our Japanese heritage, and also ingrained to us that there's good in everybody. You just have to find it. And those are the things I've tried to pass along to my children. I didn't grow up with a lot of Japanese culture. Again, it wasn't my father. Was his belief was to raise us up as Midwestern Americans, and that's the way we were raised. And actually, when I became CFO of Prudential's International Group, and we have a big business in Japan, I was a big disappointment to all the Japanese when Ken Tanji showed up, and there wasn't very much Japanese, but a lot of Minnesotan in that person. So I had that unique experience as well. But the point is I learned to relate to a whole lot of people, and to respect people and find the good in them. And I like to believe that's how I've raised, try to teach my children as well.
By the way, Ken, my wife is not Asian, but she grew up in Japan, and her first language is Japanese. She's a very successful academic, a judge. She's the chairman of MasterCard. She's very successful, but there's kind of a dilemma because she speaks fluent Japanese. And so, and I'm not Japanese, but I could be mistaken for Japanese. And so I end up with a terrible, terrible situation. So we went to Japan on vacation for 10 days. We go to a restaurant, and of course she orders all these things in Japanese, these special things that only Japanese know, right? That's not on the menu, for. And I told my wife, you really put me in a bad position, because I took 2 years of Japanese in high school, and I speak about the same as a 4-year-old, right? And so I said, you put me in a dilemma, because if I say something, I have choice. I can either say nothing, in which case the waiters all say, this guy, his wife is Western and she speaks it, and this guy is such an asshole, right? He's so arrogant, right? Or I can say something to say, we feel really sorry for this wife. She's married to a mentally retarded Japanese. So that's my choice. Well, it's a dilemma. So either way, they're disappointed, right? I'm
going to infringe on the time here, but I have a funny story similar to that. Is we acquired a company in Japan, and it was the first public analyst call I had done. I was going to explain this acquisition, and it didn't go that well. And I walked out of the conference room not feeling really great about it. And our general counsel said to me, don't worry, Ken. They're all probably just saying, wow, Ken Tanji's English is really good.
Jenny,
and I said, great point. That was I'll take that as a compliment.
Absolutely.
Jenny, your 3 kids, how have you raised them? How has it been different? How your different philosophy?
Well, first of all, I'm a pretty typical immigrant. My parents both didn't go to college and don't speak any English. So when we immigrated from Hong Kong, Macau to San Francisco, we lived in Chinatown. Of course, my parents just wanted me to go to college. Of course, wanted me to be a pharmacist, because that's what all good Chinese girls did. they did not know that I was not good in chemistry or actually good at science or math. So I actually majored in home economics. I wanted to be a home ec teacher. So when I graduated, I, worked in a store. So they were, of course, very upset. I had 4 years of college. Here I am, a salesperson in a department store. But I keep telling them that, eventually I'm going to be a buyer. So when I finally became actually the president of Old Navy, I told my boss this story. And, we were opening this big store in San Francisco and my mother was going to come in. So I told my boss, my mother's coming in. She said, well, I'm going to tell her how successful you are. So she comes in and my boss said, your daughter is in charge of all of this. So my mother thought I was in charge of the store. And no, she said, no, not the store, everything. And my mom kept nodding. And I finally said, Mickey, she's just really happy that I'm head of this store already. So everything else is okay. So I finally gave a Chinese newspaper interview because I wanted my mom to be able to read it. So how I really raise my kids is really much more American with a little bit of Chinese heritage. My kids actually want to be Chinese more than being American. They appreciate the Chinese. In fact, they think I was too much American and wanted me to have more Chinese tradition. So in fact, I'm very proud that they are. They are not very traditional in that sense. My son actually we have a vineyard and he actually has a master in viticulture and runs our vineyard up in Sonoma. And my two daughters, one is actually takes after me, but more in the fashion industry, but more creative. And my other daughter is also a merchant by trade. So I would say that I raised them to be good people, productive people, and really do something they love and passionate about. Not just a job, but something that they are proud of and that they love. To me is probably the best thing you can have. But really balancing having a great family life. I really believe that. I'm more proud of being a mother than being a business person. And to me, that is very important.
But you raised them to be successful in this country, but also with some Chinese heritage, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think as I get older, I really appreciate my Chinese heritage even more. I think when you are a typical immigrant, you want to assimilate. So I was more proud to, speak better English and with little accent. Today, I would trade to speak more language with more accent than anything. Learn to appreciate it more as you grow older, hopefully a little wiser.
Before we turn to Raj, just one comment. You were talking about how your kids love what they do, right? And I read a wonderful article last week where someone said, everyone talks about IQ and EQ, and that you have to have EQ, not just IQ, right? But they said, but no one talks about LQ. And the interviewer said, well, what's LQ? And that is, you have to love what you do. But if you have all three, you're very blessed and you're likely to do well. But being smart is helpful. Being good with people is really helpful. But if you love what you do, that really propels you well. So it sounds like your three kids got the LQ as well, right?
I like to think so.
Raj, your two kids.
Yeah, it's very similar experiences. It's just sort of, I think we raised them to be more like, they're more Americans than they are. But at the same time, they're very respectful of our culture. I don't know they crave as much like Jenny's kids to be sort of in, but they're very proud. They're very close to our families. They love going back to India. And, they're not shy about being different or, being related. And I think there's, I think a silly one little episode that's almost for humor. We live in a place where it's much more it's not that diverse part of Philadelphia. It's very Caucasian over here. So we're part of the Philadelphia Cricket Club over here. So when my daughter goes there, all her friends are like blonde or whatever. And when she was out there, when they come to present, if she goes with one more person or so, and they give the check, they always give the check to the other person when everybody else is her guest. But she's fine with it. She makes humor, she makes fun of it and kind of doesn't take that as any negative. And they apologize, obviously, because it's not that they're trying to be rude, but things like that. They're just I think they're good people. I think that's the most important.
So we're going to end with my asking Ken to help me with one of these questions, which I do not understand. And it's not a repetitive question, but it comes from someone you know, Fred Katayama. All right.
Okay.
Who you know well, right? He says, Ken, did knowing hockey help you? Actually, he said, do no win G hockey help you, which I couldn't figure out, but I suddenly realized there was an extra space between N and G. So did knowing hockey help you?
It helped me get into college. Otherwise, I never would have gotten into the school I got into. But other than that, I'm not so sure it's did much for my business career.
Yeah, and you went to a college where hockey was a big deal, right? I know, right? Well, look, I want to end, and first of all, I want to thank all the attendees. We had some really good questions. The only ones I didn't read were where there was an overlap with the other ones. I want to thank the three panelists for spending this time, but also to sharing some really good insights and advice to the attendees. It's really the panelists that make these things go well. And I think the takeaway is there's some key things to focus on to be successful in your career, also in raising your kids. And there are differences among ethnicities within Asia. And I think it's very important for us to learn from each other, not only learn from each other within Asian groups, but we need to learn from the Jewish and American community, the Latinos, the African Americans, because they're doing things that are helping them be successful. And we should help them because at times they help us when there's, for example, the current tension against Asians because of China-US, and we can learn things from other people. So with that, I want to thank everyone. This is being recorded and will be available on the Committee of 100 website. I'm sure, Ken, you'll binge watch it and watch it 4 or 5 times, right? Or at least next one is July 20th, which is obstacles in academics. And then we're going to have Margaret Chin September 11th on her book, Stuck. So thank you all. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.